Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, then we examine a single relevant question from that passage. And today I'm joined by Sharon Schwartz, and we're looking at a passage from Matthew 13, which is a parable. So I'm just going to read the beginning of it because I want to cover a lot of information about parables. Later that same day, Jesus left the house and sat beside the lake. A large crowd soon gathered around him, so he got into a boat. Then he sat there and taught as the people stood on the shore. He told many stories in the form of parables, such as this one. Listen, a farmer went out to plant some seeds. As he scattered them across the field, some seeds fell on a footpath. The birds came and ate them. Other seeds fell on shallow soil with underlying rock. The seeds sprouted quickly because the soil was shallow, but the plants soon wilted under the hot sun, and since they didn't have deep roots, they died. Other seeds fell among thorns, and that grew up and choked out the tender plants. Still other seeds fell on fertile soil, and they produced a crop that was 30, 60, even 100 times as much as had been planted. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. So this is the parable, and he gives the meaning of it in just a moment. But parables are these stories drawn from everyday life that illustrate a religious truth. So they compare familiar situations, persons, events to an unfamiliar or unrecognized truth. So that's what Jesus is after. I want to talk to you about something familiar so you can understand something that may be unfamiliar. The hearers of these parables often identify with a particular character and react to the parable's reversals of expectations. Parables act both as a window into the kingdom of God. So that's the first thing. So we see what God's trying to accomplish, but they also act as a mirror that convicts us as listeners, helping us to be more like Christ. So there are multiple parables. So I'm just going to kind of skim through some of them. Themes that parables could include are things like responses to Jesus' teaching. These stories call listeners to respond faithfully. Examples to this might be the parable of the 10 virgins or the wise and foolish builders. Another type of parable would be a warning against imminent judgment. These would include the parable of the rich fool and the parable of the shut door. Others are kingdom of God parables. These stories proclaim the coming of the kingdom of God and illustrate characteristics. Examples of this theme might be wedding guests, the parables of the wedding guests, and the patch and the wineskins. Then there's parables about growth of the kingdom. So the mustard seed and yeast would illustrate the special presence of God. Parables about God's mercy. These stories show God as one who offers unconditional love. These would be things like the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. Some would display God's mercy by Jesus, such as the rich man and Lazarus and the Pharisee and the tax collector. Some would call us to deeper discipleship. These stories would be things like the hidden treasure, the costly pearl, places at the table, or prayer, the persistent widow. Others would talk about the consequences of a lack of discipleship. So the parable of the wicked tenants in Mark 12 or Matthew 11 illustrate these destructive lack of discipleship. Some point to marks of a godly community. So stories like the parable of the weeds. Some would talk about the influence of Jesus' followers. So where he talks about them being the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Throughout the gospel, he employs these memorable parables to depict life in the kingdom of God. He also presents this image of God through them. They also show God coming to the aid of social outcasts, people who are marginalized, disenfranchised, underprivileged, like Samaritans, tax collectors, beggars, widows. They all become heroes. He talks about so many things in parables. Finally, Jesus uses parables to help us envision the type of difference a community of Christ followers can make in the world in this salt of the earth city on a hill parable. So parables are a really important part of Jesus' teaching. You are a storyteller yourself.
I am. I
Yeah.
love it.
And you do it in your everyday life, but you do it in ministry as well. So why are parables so important? And what is your takeaway specifically from this parable?
I think parables stories make it real. It brings it to life. Where, when you read, sometimes it can be cold. But if you tell a story, something that everybody can relate to, you can feel in your heart, I can feel in my heart. It makes it feel like it's not just a once upon a time there was a prince.
Right.
It makes it, he was real. So every lesson I teach, that's my approach, that it's a story. It's about somebody alive. Let me tell you what happened, Now, this story I love because the farmer sows. Now, in my vision, now we drill seed, but then they just had a bag and they threw it. They scattered it. And the seed flew everywhere. Why didn't he just scatter it on the fertile field? Well, because he just didn't know what would happen to the other. He wasn't going to judge that. What I love about it, there is fertile field. So he had put the work in before. It wasn't that he was lazy, then preached and expected harvest. He had put the work in. But he didn't think God so small that God would only send harvest to the fertile field. He trusted that one stalk of corn could survive the road path or the thorns, the weeds, the rocky. Maybe just one ear of corn he could get out of it. And seed is typically much cheaper than the harvest you would do. So the investment cost would be minimum, but the possibility of reward was huge.
Right.
And I think that's how, we need to put in the time. I'm going to tell you what bothers me about this. I have heard it said that very thing, that he hadn't put the work in. The fertile soil just happened to be there, and I don't believe that. I see a freshly plowed field, that he's done, and he's gotten the rocks out of it, because apparently it's all in the same field. So why is the whole field not full of rocks? Well, it probably was at one time. But he had put the time in to make a fertile field, but he didn't put God in a box by just harvesting that, throwing seed there. And I think that's important for us, that we at least I do. Confess. I tend to, those that I put the most time in, I preach to more, or I encourage to come to church more, where maybe the mechanic I see twice a year, I don't.
Right.
I need to cast that seed on that mechanic, because I don't know who else has been out there, or who else God's going to send up to water and pick up the rocks or pull the weeds, or, so that was, to me, I need to make sure I'm not discriminatory to where I scatter.
You talked about, so today we don't do much scattering.
Yeah.
Now, I think grass seed, for the most part, still gets scattered or spread, but mainly because it doesn't require, you want it to be on top of each other. But you talked about drilling seed.
Yeah.
So there are, you would know better than I do, but there are mechanical instruments that tractors use, or that are intentionally meant to put a seed far enough in the ground that it's not going to be eaten by birds.
It's optima.
That's
level.
right. It's not going to be eaten by birds. The wind's not going to blow it away. These are the things he talks about in this story.
Right.
Because I think that's something I'm going to go revisit after we leave here. So I'm going to ask you on off the cuff. What are some ways we can be intentional about drilling seeds? Like, instead of just being, we're talking about Jesus as whoever will listen. How can we be intentional about making sure we put it at the right place at the right time, at the right depth, so that the wind don't blow it away? Like, are there any ways you can think of to do that?
Well,
I know you're not prepared for that question.
No, well, I mean, that's a great question. Well, my first thought is that when we wake up in the morning before our feet hit the floor, we need to say, "Now, Lord, you direct today."
Mm-hmm.
There are things that I personally do, especially to an unbeliever, that I try to show kindness to. For instance, my mechanic. I always give him a tip. Okay. I always, if I'm going first thing, can I stop and pick you up a biscuit? I do those little things to let him know I love him, and I do love him. He's wonderful. My doctors and nurses, I take them a gift every special occasion. I think I'm drilling, because then when they are struggling, they come to me. I had a male nurse, when I was in the hospital, and I was purposely, joking with him kind. And about the second weekend, he came in and he just was off his game. And I finally said, "What's going on?" He had just found out his and his wife weren't able to conceive a child. And he started crying when he told me. And he said, "I'm afraid I'm a loser." So I told him, I said, "Well, the first thing you do when you go home today, you take her in your arms and you tell her she takes her breath away." Said, "She'll remember that. And then you all talk about how you're going to spread the love you want for a child." And I told him, I said, "Look, more than half of my grandchildren are adopted. Way less than half have my bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
But I promise you, nobody could tell you the difference. If you didn't know the history, if you saw a stranger and said, pick the ones that are not of her blood, you'll not be able to tell. You can love." The day before I got out of the hospital, he came and had heard I was getting out, and he was on another wing of the hospital and came to thank me. And I encouraged him to go to church. That's seed drilling, But unfortunately, we only have 24 hours in a day, and there's only so many holes we can drill. And that's why I think scattering's important too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some things happen as a byproduct of just us being present, or should. The example I would use, here's a parable, kind of, sort of, not exactly, but my wife loves to feed the birds. So she's got bird feeders, all kinds of bird feeders, hummingbird feeders, regular bird feeders, and some of them turn into squirrel feeders because the squirrels want to eat. But she'll buy particularly the block of seed, and hang it in the tree. And underneath that tree, it is not the grass we have in our yard, but it's some kind of green grass that comes up anytime you get warm weather. It's more bright, but it's coming from the seed. There's something in the seed that's when it falls on the ground, it comes up. Well, what she's after is to feed the birds.
Right.
A byproduct of that is there's grass under the tree.
That's right.
She's not doing it to grow grass under the tree. That's just a byproduct of.
It's the beauty of it.
That's right. That's something else.
Yeah.
And the reality is, if we're living a godly life, there are going to be byproducts that we didn't plan for that to happen. We didn't plan to have that benefit. That is not even what we're after. But it is just a byproduct of living a godly life. But I think we also have to be intentional too. The other side of this story is when you get to choose, am I putting this in good soil or bad soil? You choose good soil.
Yes.
You're intentional about it because you said we only have so much time in a day. And if we are wasting, and that's a terrible word to use, but if we're wasting our time on opportunities that God never intended for us to be a part of, it doesn't mean that it's not somebody's job.
Right.
But it may not be our assignment. And we miss the assignment that we have, because I believe all of us have good dark soul somewhere that we're supposed to be planting.
Absolutely.
And we got to know, that praying in the morning, God, guide my steps today so that I come in contact with the exact right people to accomplish your mission is important. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you will be back with us tomorrow as we continue an examination of our weekly reading.